the impetus behind it certainly comes from that. For example, the Liberal Democrats, the Electoral Reform Society, removed from its webpage the remarks about how awful AV was so that it could campaign for it. It's a proportional representation advocating group. Of course, it's important to point out that this isn't one of those systems. The story, it's a bit as if you go to the, you're ill, you go to the chemist to get some medicine, and they say, I'm terribly sorry, I haven't got medicine for your illness. Still, look, here's another medicine. Would you like to take some of this? So it would cure somebody else's illness. Perhaps you should walk out with the wrong medicine. No, not at all. But indeed, it is, just because AV is not a proportional system, it doesn't mean that it has none of the disadvantages of proportional systems. And the promotion of coalition is one such. So I don't accept any inconsistency about this. There are two distinct points. So where does that leave us? Presidential leadership, single leadership election, perfectly sensible for AV, nothing to do with the argument. Coalition, very bad thing. Proportionality, no. AV offers you nothing for parliamentary elections. That's still where I end up.
And any further questions? Androna?
Yes, my biggest problem with British politics is political apathy. Having first past the post or AV is not really a problem to me because I think both are flawed, although I prefer AV. But my biggest problem is that with first past the post, we've developed a huge political apathy in the country, and no matter what we do, we can't get a turnout more than 60% maximum. And I know that's a problem across the globe, but it's very big here in the UK. And my question is what the relationship between first past the post and political apathy you think there is, and what relationship could there be between AV and political apathy, because obviously people are waiting for a change somehow, because first past the post has developed this latent political potential in the public. So what do you think would happen with AV?
But
currently have two questions now. The first question is directed to Bradshaw. It's about the supporters of the Labour Party who support the AV. I'm actually doing some research on this, and I've realised that the supporters of Labour Party have been torn between the yes and the no vote, and the equilibrium between the yes and the no vote has been shifting for the past few months. And would you agree with me that this is because the Labour Party itself is torn between whether to vote for or against AV, and what steps is the Labour leadership doing in order to garner the support of the Labour supporters for the yes vote? And the next question is towards both Ms. Bradshaw and Dr. Porter. I've gone through the yes campaign and no campaign website, and I've realized that they have given contradicting answers on essentially the same point. I think one of the points, for example, is whether AV would encourage technical voting. On the yes vote, it's like what Mr. Bradshaw says, you vote with your heart and vote with your head, and there will not be any technical voting. However, in the no vote campaign, it says that it will actually reinvent technical voting, and then it gives a link to LSE blog that then explains how tactical voting can occur with really largely complex mathematical arguments. So as from an average citizen point of view, I would be really confused whether these arguments will hold up. So that's my question.
Just in the middle here.
Hi, I just have one question for each. For Mr. Mathematically, there is a critical group point in the AV. It's possible you can, by some consideration, it's possible to vote some least likely by all the voters to actually become the winning of the voting. I haven't got a written example to show it, but that is a serious issue for the AV. And do you know about that question and how people will solve that? And for the doctor, the simple one, just particularly from last election, someone passed the dot seat without reaching the majority, not even 40, not 30% of it. And some guy coming in with only like less than 30% of support coming to Parliament. Effectively, it's like by 70% of people. There's clearly something wrong with this system. Okay, what's your view on it? Thank you.
Well, quite a lot there. First of all, apathy. Well, I think it's very interesting if you look at electoral systems around the world where you have the lowest and where you have the highest turnouts. And there's no doubt you have the lowest turnouts under first past the post in Britain and the United States, traditionally. And I would argue that one of the reasons for that is because so many voters are in effect disenfranchised. If you live in a safe seat, your vote never counts for anything. What's the point if you live in inner Glasgow of ever voting Tory? What's the point if you live in rural Norfolk of ever voting Labour? There isn't any, basically. So what's going to motivate you to go out and vote? And the great, I think, advantage of AV is that even in those areas, you can use your first preference to vote, as we've discussed, with your heart, before then voting with your head for the person you think's less likely to, or more likely to beat the person you want least. I'll come on then to the tactical voting issue in a second. So I think it could play a positive role in terms of turnout, but also political engagement in those parts of the country where the Labour Party is pretty much extinct, or the Tories are extinct, or even the Lib Dems are extinct. I think it could help rebuild party activity and a party base. Very interesting question about the debate going on inside the Labour Party, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there are different opinions in the Labour Party. The opinion polls indicate that most of our voters support a yes vote, as do most Liberal Democrat voters, and understandably most Conservative voters want to keep first past the post because it benefits the Tory party. And most of the shadow cabinet, in fact the overwhelming majority of the shadow cabinet, are campaigning for a yes vote. But there's been a very strong temptation in recent months among quite a lot of my colleagues, I'll be honest about this, to see the referendum as an opportunity to give Nick Clegg a bloody nose because of the level of anger that people feel about his betrayal of his promises on student fees and various other things. Now, the argument I would make to those colleagues is, please don't yield to the temptation to give Nick Clegg a short-term kicking, if you like. I don't think there's any chance the Lib Dems are going to leave the government if the No campaign wins. One or two people are indulging in that level of wishful thinking. I would much rather we gave David Cameron a bloody nose by voting yes, and didn't lose sight of the bigger picture we've got in terms of changing our electoral system, and it's the only chance we're going to have, by the way, in our lifetimes to do so. But there is a debate going on in the party, there's no doubt about that, and there tends to be quite a strong correlation in the Labour Party, actually, as in most parties, between MPs who have safe seats and their affection for first past the post. You then complained about contradictory statements. I mean, I would urge people, I think you're going to be given some literature if you're interested on the way out, which will have the website addresses for both the yes and the no campaigns. If you are interested, if your interest exceeds the satisfaction that you're going to get in this meeting this evening, do go and have a look on the website. I mean, I would say that one of the deliberate tactics of the No campaign is to try to make this sound very complicated, so that people who don't know think, oh, well, what the hell, we'll just stick with the status quo because we know that, we're familiar with it, and it's simple. I mean, I hope there aren't any Australians here who feel offended by this, but if the Australians can manage to use AV, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't manage to use it too. But the specific point you made about tactical voting. It is true, of course, that under AV, there is an element, or there can be an element of tactical voting with your second preference. Because if you live in a constituency where you don't think your first preference stands a chance, you vote for your first preference first, and then you vote in the same way as many people do now, tactically, for the next person you like next best, who you think is best placed to beat the person you like least. So it's true that you still can have some tactical voting, but what it releases you from is the need to vote tactically. You have a choice. At the moment, many voters in this country vote tactically and they only have one vote. They don't have a choice. If they want to affect the outcome of the election in their seat, they're forced by the system to vote for a party who's not the party they would naturally vote for. And then finally, if I understood your question rightly, you asked whether it's possible for the least liked candidate to win. I may have misheard. It's certainly possible for the least disliked candidate to win, but not for the least liked candidate to win, because the least liked candidate will come bottom and drop out in the in the first round. One of the reasons, for example, the BNP are campaigning for a no vote is that they realised they would never get 50% of the vote in any constituency. And so AV would completely stuff the BNP and extremist parties, although it would probably help the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. And it would also mean that green ideas and ideas from those smaller parties would, I think, influence the bigger parties more. But you're right. I mean, you pay as your money, you take your choice under the system. First past the post, as you rightly say, can deliver you an MP with 28% of the vote. AV can deliver you an MP who didn't get the highest number of first preferences, but did get 50% of first, second, and in a very, very rare occasion, second preferences of the third candidate. But the question you have to ask yourself is, would you rather have an MP who had 28% support and was opposed by more than 70%, or an MP who got over 50% of first, second, and sometimes third preferences? And I think it's that latter MP who would have a stronger mandate.
The apathy question. Do we have a problem with voter apathy? Well, yeah, probably we do. Voter engagement with politics generally, perhaps less so. Two things on that. One is the argument about the Glasgow voter that Ben's making doesn't persuade me at all. What's the point of going and voting Tory if you live in Glasgow? Well, here's a related question. What's the point of going and voting for anybody if you live anywhere? It's a fantastically small chance of your vote changing the result. People troop out to vote nonetheless. There is political engagement there that does not depend on people making estimates of whether it's worth their time, bearing in mind the probability that their vote will matter. When does one person's vote matter? That's not the point at all. On the apathy question more generally, where does that apathy come from? My concern about that, insofar as it depends on the voting system at all, which I wouldn't be inclined to emphasise, insofar as it does, I would have thought two things to promote apathy are not being able to tell much difference between the candidates and feeling that you've got no power to effect the kind of result you want individually or as a democracy. Well, what's AV going to do? It's going to make everybody look as much as they can like the other people whose second preferences they want, so more homogeneity, less distinction between the candidates, and I've said this before, but it fits here, the point about coalition. You get an election result, composition of parliament, determined by the people together, and then the politicians decide who the government is. How is that going to make people more keen to go out and exercise their vote? That's the sort of thing that promotes the feeling of helplessness. These politicians, they run things, we don't. Very bad. Much better to have a system which puts the power with the voters. When the votes are counted, the election's decided. Not in 2010, says Ben. Quite right. Well, the system's not perfect. We could talk about how to design a system that would always result in one-party government. Such systems can be invented. They're not on the agenda. I'm not here to propose to you my own concoction of an electoral system. I'm here to say that twice since the war, we've had a hung parliament after an election, and that's a pretty good record. The referendums come up because this is one occasion when we don't have that. Labour leadership, leave that one. AV and tactical voting, tactical voting is always possible. If there are more than two options, more than two candidates, it doesn't matter what the voting system is, there's always a way of voting tactically, and it's not in the benign second preference way that Ben is describing. It is a little bit complicated to describe. Never mind, you can read all about it in my book. But think of, there are several examples. If you can hold it in your head, think of the case where you've got Labour winning and the